Welcome to this first event in the War and Entropy program line of Studium Generale. The first event called War and Rhetoric. Feel free to join. Come, yeah, you're welcome, more than welcome. I want to share an anecdote of one of our first speaker, actually, Ivana Ivkovic, one of tonight's speakers. Once told me how she looked at the map of Europe in the late 1990s, and I'm not sure if you remember this, Ivana, and suddenly didn't recognize what she saw. The outline of her country had changed. What used to be Yugoslavia, the place she grew up in, was now Serbia. Not just the name, but the shape, the whole. It had lost its meaning. The moment gave her a profound sense of dislocation, as if something she had always assumed to be stable, even part of who she was simply disappeared. I'm not sure if you remember this anecdote. Yeah. Well, I guess you do. Well. Yeah. And I recognize something of that feeling for me, for instance, during the pandemic, when close friends suddenly became adversaries. People I thought I shared values with began using words I never expected to hear from them. Their tone hardened, perhaps my tone also. Their ideas turned foreign. And that's why we've titled this series War and Entropy. Entropy, as you all know, is a measure of disorder in a system. And disorder seems to be increasing everywhere. The old structures are crumbling and chaos rushes in. The genie is out of the bottle and no one knows what comes next. And I think most of you will recognize this feeling. Every time you check the news site or whatever, you think, now what? What's happening now? So let me ask, as a starters, you something. Have you ever had the experience that a word you used to trust suddenly sounds strange, or a sudden shift in meaning? I wonder if you could share your experiences with this. Do you want to share your experience? Wait a minute. I'll keep the phone.
Thank you. Well, we were thinking about freedom of speech. It used to mean we are all able to discuss in a civilized manner, even contested things. But lately it is used to justify that you can put anything, even lies, online, and you cannot be held accountable. So I think this has changed for me dramatically from being almost human right or our democratic value to now being something that I have to think about. Mm-hmm. How do we regulate it but not take it away? Yeah. So that was a bit of a dilemma.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example. Thank you very much. Who wants to share their ideas about a word suddenly changing? Yeah.
Well, in the same line, facts to me used to be a very simple concept like true or not true. But recently, I have really been confronted with the fact that people have different ideas about what is considered a fact. Yeah. So, yeah, misinformation being framed as a fact, for example.
Yeah, beautiful example. Freedom of speech, facts, things which were so convenient to us, suddenly changed the last years. So this evening we're going to talk about rhetoric. The rhetoric before a war, during a conflict, etc. And we have three very eminent speakers, I would say, and I'll introduce them when they come up to speak. And the first one is Ivana Ivkovic, and she's a political philosopher born and raised in former Yugoslavia. She examines how political upheaval reshapes meanings and identities. Her work is grounded in both theory and lived experience. As a witness to the collapse of Yugoslavia, she saw how words like brotherhood and unity, once symbols of solidarity, became hollow and then hostile. So in tonight's talk, she'll explore how language deteriorates when political systems break down. From Yugoslavia to Ukraine to Trump's America, Ivana shows how trusted words can quickly become weapons. So, Ivana, could I ask you to... Yeah, thank you very much.
Of course, thank you. Thank you for this introduction. Thank you for sharing the story about the outline of my former country, that is still unrecognizable to me. But today I would like to talk to you about language. I don't think that anyone here would be surprised if I tell you that language can be weaponized, right? We all know that words can be used to incite fear, they can be used to justify aggression, they can be used to divide whole communities. But the specific way in which language operates within a conflict, and especially a violent conflict, is far from elementary. And I would like you to take you to a philosophical tour, to take up several philosophical lenses to look at those mechanisms and to provide several perspectives, to connect them to some modern day or not so modern day examples. I have a lot of examples, of course, from Yugoslavia, but we can also talk about the United States and Donald Trump and populist rhetoric and a rhetoric during the war and Russia, Ukraine and Israel, Palestine, and unfortunately many other conflicts that are going on as well in the world. So I will take you on a tour through 4 philosophers, through the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote about social decay and war of all against all, to Hannah Arendt and her perspective on public sphere and language and a common world we share or maybe don't anymore, to Carl Schmitt, who is a theoretician of the friend-enemy conflict, friend-enemy distinction in politics, and finally to Judith Butler and her ideas of performative side of language, especially in conflict and hate speech. So let's begin. And so the first perspective is that of Thomas Hobbes, who described in a kind of thought experiment what would happen if there was no central authority whatsoever. And he imagines that life without such an authority would be a state of relentless conflict, right? It would be a state of war of all against all. It's a grim picture. He imagines that there is no arts, no letters, no society, but there is continuous fear. People are delivered to danger, to the possibility of violent death. He describes life in this, what he calls state of nature, as famously solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's the picture. And what is interesting for our discussion here is that what happens in this atmosphere of universal distrust and fear is that any possibility of meaningful communication, of dialogue, of talking to one another, of mutual understanding, also starts to crumble, right? So if everyone is a potential enemy, then words are no longer tools we use for mutual understanding. They are possibly used for deception or for threats. And in absence of an authority, we cannot trust them. We cannot trust the meaning of words. We cannot trust promises people make. Because everybody is only engaged in their own survival. So language loses its power to communicate reliably. Moreover, language loses its power to communicate altogether. Because there is no agreement anymore, and this is interesting, on the meaning of words. So even when it happens that people are not purposefully trying to deceive each other, they do not agree on what their words mean. So there is this continuous possibility of misunderstanding, which feeds distrust, which again feeds conflict. And in a certain way, Hobbes here makes a kind of a reference or an echo of the famous story of the Tower of Babel, which you all know, where languages got confused and people cannot cooperate anymore. But I would like to submit that the possibility that Hobbes confronts us with is an even more unsettling one, because it's not that people are not able to communicate with one another because they have a different language. The possibility Hobbes presents is that even though they speak the same language, they still cannot understand each other. Well, now, maybe you think, okay, this is a typical philosophical contraption, but I have an example of this. I have an example. And there is a perfect illustration of this principle in a very old absurdist comedy in former Yugoslavia, which was called Surrealist Hit List. And it was made up there was a comedy show, by the way, from Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia. And as a former Yugoslavia started to decay, a large part of it had the same language. Serbo-Croatian was, with some variations, more or less the same language in Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, and Bosnia, but not anymore. It was divided into several languages, Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian. And these comedians, they made a show, they made a sketch out of a translator translating from Serbian to Croatian to Bosnian, basically repeating the same sentence over and over again, when people were still not able to understand. What did he say? He said, we're going to grab a beer after that. Did he say we're going to grab a beer after this? Yes, we said we're going to grab it. And then like 1,000 times over without any result. And this is like the tragedy of entropy of language, if you want entropy and discussion of entropy, that happens without a central authority on language. And this is interesting because this is, for us nowadays, it's an unsettling idea that someone wants to control language. But Hobbes provides an idea that without it, there is this decay of meaning. There has to be some agreement and some central authority that fixes the meaning of words. If that doesn't happen, they just go their own way. So whoever rules must control civil, military, judicial, and worldly, ecclesiastical powers, and even the words. So whoever governs must govern the language. And only in this way could this be prevented, this slide into this war of all against all in perpetual conflict and distrust. That's obviously a tall order, right? This is not an easy thing to do, but it does tell us something, that it tells us that there is more in this transformation of language than just the emergence of, pejorative terms, hate speech, and inciting and whipping up hatred. There is an attempt sometimes to control language, and maybe if you look to the examples, I go back again to collapse of former Yugoslavia and the regime of Slobodan Milosevic, who, during his rule in the end of the 90s, he adopted a media law that allowed him basically, with a special counsel, to prosecute offenses. And this special court could impose very heavy fines. And there were several independent newspapers that were persecuted under this media law, because they referred to Albanians killed in Kosovo as of people and not as terrorists. So there is this attempt of controlling not only the narrative, but the very meaning of words, the language itself. And, well, we know the history, notwithstanding the huge amount of control Milosevic had above the media. He eventually lost his control, he lost his power, he fell in a peaceful uprising in 2000. So this underscores the idea that it's not elementary, it's not easy to control language. And I think that in the last years, and especially with the importance of social media, that only became increasingly difficult. Any attempt to control the language in this way would run into enormous difficulties nowadays. So this begs the question, is this all that there is? Are there other mechanisms at work? And I do think that there are. I do think that there are. So there is just one of them is this attempt to control. But there are some others, and I could not call something like that an attempt to control. For example, to refer again once more to former Yugoslavia, one of the stories that was propagated in the state media was that in Sarajevo, that was already under siege in the 90s, literally, Muslim extremists feed Serbian children to lions in Sarajevo Zoo. And, I mean, attempt to control the narrative, to convince people that this is true? Is this really the framework we are trying to understand such absurdist messages? And we only became more familiar with this type of news, right, lately, in the recent years. So how can we grapple these shifts, you know, where language starts to be a bit absurd and starts to be separated from reality and making sometimes ludicrous claims, right? And for this, we turn to a second philosopher, who is Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt wrote an essay that is called Lying in Politics in the 70s. And in this essay, he says that organizing lying, basically, is not aiming to make people believe specific lies. It actually aims to make fog, so that to pollute, to intoxicate, right, the public sphere, to the point that people would basically believe just anything. So there you have it, decades and decades before social media and our post-truth and all our worries about, you know, the misinformation. Hannah Arendt says, you know, there is the flood of spin, of conspiracies, of alternative facts, which is not even meant to send lies. It's meant to blur the distinction between truth and falsehood. It's a strategy. So that people become skeptical of everything and unable to trust information or engage in any rational debate. She says at this point, they cannot distinguish between right or wrong either. And their moral judgment collapses along with the truth. And the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for truth is that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world, in a shared world, we live in a shared world, according to Hannah Arendt. That means also that not physically, but also in terms of meaning, we recognize the same things. This is basically destroyed. So this is Hannah Arendt's take on what happens with language in times of crisis. Is that basically using language as a kind of weapon to confuse rather than as a means of communication and to engage into mutual understanding can shatter our common world. That's her idea. And I think there are so many examples of the post-truth era that one can refer to in this context. And not in the last place what is happening in the context of Trump's United States and the inciting quite violent language, but also endorsing all kind of weird narratives. Basically the very idea of truth suffered serious historical blows. And this is the nightmare in Hannah Arendt's terms, that the public discourse decays so far that it's just replaced with tribal loyalties, right? But this is not, in her mind, what belongs to language. Language is not tribal. Like, this is language already decayed. This is language already fallen into a lower state of being. Entropy, again. Okay, so let me speed this up a little bit, and I want you to take you to a third perspective very quickly, and this is a perspective of a German legal theorist who is somewhat historically controversial because he was a kind of advisor to the Nazi Party in the 30s. But he's now widely studied because his idea that political is a domain of conflict between friends and enemies, right? And that this distinction between friends and enemy is essential to politics, and that you cannot even go beyond it. It kind of you cannot really leave it. And one of the examples of language that belongs to this, antagonistic idea of politics is the idea of existential enemy, existential other. So not just other, somebody who wants the things that I have or our territory, but the existential other is somebody who threatens the very way of life, right? Whose existence as such is a threat to us. And I think one of the oldest examples that we have of such a staging of existential other within language goes back to ancient time in Greece, to the history of Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, which was between Sparta and Athens. And there is this famous speech where Corinth tries to convince Sparta to join the war. And in this famous speech, the conflict is staged as a conflict between two ways of life, between Athens and Sparta. And of course, the Athens are kind of decadent, not really full of character, and in this sense, an existential threat to everything that is noble. And this, again, you can recognize in so many restaging of, patriots versus traitors, the believers versus the infidels, the allies versus the enemies or evil enemies. And especially during the Cold War and the War of Terror, there are so many tropes in which this staging of friend-enemy was repeated over and over again. But also, for example, to refer back to Trump, the fact that Trump is referring to the media as enemies of the people, right? Is staging the very same kind of existential threat. And of course, this staging can legitimize further all kind of extraordinary measures, or simply ignoring journalists, for that matter. And I'm not going to talk about it much, because I know Tony van der Tocht is going to talk about it in a couple of minutes, but in the manner where Russia stages the conflict with Ukraine, you will find a lot of such staging of, friend, enemy, and existential enemy as well. But more on that later, right? So fourth and the last, and then I'll wrap up, is a perspective from an American philosopher, Judith Butler. And she wrote a lot about performative force of language in the way we shape our individual but also collective identities. Most of her work is on gender, basically, but it also extends to the political sphere. She wrote a book in the end of the 90s called Excitable Speech. It's about language and the performative, the idea that language does not only describe but shape reality actively. And she examines in that book how, for example, hate speech or slurs, slogans, performatively enact certain realities. And one of her interesting insights, I think, is that she doesn't only, like Schmidt, stages this existential other. She emphasizes a different side to this use of language, that such, staging of the other as in some way not human even, so not only as an existential enemy, but as not human, reduces people to lives that are not real or not grievable. What does it mean? Some deaths can be grieved, others are not worth grieving. And one of the strategies of language shaping reality is that it stages some lives who might be lost as lives that are not worth grieving. And one of the most notorious examples historically is in the wake of the genocide in Rwanda in the 90s, where Hutus and Tutsis, Hutus had control of the media, and they repeatedly staged Tutsis as cockroaches. Right? So this extreme dehumanizing language this is not only demonizing, obviously demonizing the group, but it's also staging those lives as lives that can be lost and don't need to be grieved, and opens the door to violence and atrocities. These lives become lives that do not matter through language, through the use of language. There are a lot of more recent examples, of course, and also the example that was debated in the court case that South Africa started about Israel intervention in Gaza, right? Because there was this moment where Defense Minister Yoav Gallant stated, "We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." And this is basically the whole idea of dehumanizing the other in conflict all over again. And to end on a more hopeful note, because this is obviously a very violent side to language, is that because language is in a way capable of shaping reality by naming things, it can also be reclaimed, Butler says. So this very same mechanisms that allow language to portray, for example, the other, to dehumanize the other, also allow, for example, activist groups to reclaim language and to restage the narrative, to try to reshape reality, right, through their own actions. I think that what you can see, for example, is the amount of memes and humorous language used, among other places, in Ukrainian war. Like Ukrainians respond to the occupation not only with resistance, but also with this verbal resistance online. So there is a huge amount of memes about the Snake Island. There is a kind of wordplay of NATO. There is a meme of the Madonna holding a missile that is very popular. And in all those ways, they are reclaiming sometimes also the slurs used by the official Russian media and reappropriating them into a new language of resistance. And I think that Butler has written a lot about the possibility of courageous language, not only hate language, but the courageous language, and the ways of transform conflict and reappropriate language as well. And she wrote a lot about Occupy and Black Lives Matter. Movements that use language to try to convey a new reality, right? And to bring new realities into being, but also to solidify the resistance and the solidarity. And that what is threatening is maybe also hopeful. The fact that language has a world-making power, and that we can see its, polarizing side in social breakdowns, the us against them, to kill and be killed. But we can also hope that the words can be used in attempt to reclaim our common humanity. And she reminds us that as every slogan, as every utterance is building a reality, as participants in language, we are not merely passive, we are also active. We have the agency to change those realities. So the hope is, if the words can orchestrate and lead to violence and war, can they also lead us out of it? The way out of the darkness, in this case, could maybe begin with reclaiming language, with naming the truth, with rejecting dehumanization. And the question we should ask ourselves is, how do we strengthen the kind of speech, the kind of language that can withstand crisis, that can withstand social decay and a call to violence, so that our public discourse, our fragile bond, does not collapse, but remains a path that leads back us to common understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very beautiful and also a very, let's say, profound speech. There is some room for questions now. There's also room for questions later, after all three have spoken, but for now there's also a room for questions. I'll keep it.
Yeah. Thank you very much for speaking. Very interesting. I was wondering about another development that has been happening with, I relate more to like a direct conflict, or more like a direct attack that is currently happening. Taking, for example, then America, where the fog that you mentioned becomes more of a direct attack, where the words that are used to combine or harmonize or unite people, like words like woke, these kind of things, they are being weaponized and turned on each other, in this way becoming a very effective tool of like dividing the people that use them to connect. It's like a divide and conquer type of methodology, to keep the people like individualized, keep them docile for the powers to be, to maintain their control. But how do you relate this force to the thing that you said in the beginning, with the more everybody becomes individualized, the more language decays? So how do you think that the weaponization, like the direct individual use, or the direct attack to individualize, relates to the decay of language through individualization? And is there like a point where this breaks?
Could I translate that question maybe also to the question, how could possibly woke response to this, threat of being marginalized or individualized through this politics? Sure. Well, I think that one of the strategies there is to deal with attack through language is sometimes to adopt in a humorous way the insult and turn it around, right? To reappropriate it. And I'm not completely sure in which way that goes for what's happening right now, but that is a strategy that goes, for ages, in a response of not merely like a rational counter arguments, but playfully taking away the weapons and turning them into some kind of a, new joke or new ways of common identity. Sometimes that is adopted again as a new common identity within a group. Is that an answer to your question?
Sorry.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah, but this what you're saying now, is that the thing that the current government of, say, the United States are doing, or is that advice for what we as the citizens could do to their attack of the return weaponization of, say, the word woke?
That is what the possible answer could look like. Yeah.
Okay, another question here.
I'm very curious in the magic of words. If you look at Vladimir Putin, I have 3 examples. First, he denied to use a word war. He forced everybody to say that it's a SWOR, the
special operation.
Operation. And then, second example, he never say name Navalny. And third one, I forgot one. Mobilization. He don't want to say that it's a completely mobilization, that they are partly mobilization, частичная mobilization. And how is he aware of how this mechanism works? But it looks that it's really very calculated.
I think Tony van der Tocht is going to explain that later on, but perhaps you first.
Maybe I'll be short because I think this will be addressed largely. But let me just say, obviously, there's a strategy. This is no accident, but it's a bit complex because there are reasons for Russia not to call it war that are not dependent on their own choice, but also on the fact that there is an international right, and if they acknowledge that it's a war, then they fall under it, right? So there is also some pragmatic reasons not to call it a war, as well as some strategic internal reasons. But then again, the not mentioning Navalny, that's also interesting that there are some, we didn't discuss that it's not only the shift in language, but also the silence within language, right? That we do not speak of. That is an interesting phenomenon in times of crisis and conflict. There are things that are left unsaid in the media and that are avoided consciously. And I think that's just as interesting as use of language is the places the language avoids, right?
Well, what can we do? I mean, we're here. I think people here are perhaps anxious or worried about situations or want to take some kind of action. What can we do? If words lost their meaning, if words are unsaid?
Specifically in case of Navalny and the silence
take it
about
more generally,
that, or well, it's very difficult to provide a very general. As a very general strategy, the things that I tried to address at the end of my lecture, the ways of thinking about language as something that connects us and binds us in a common sphere, and is not primarily meant to divide us, could pave the way of, thinking about how we use it.
Okay.
As a more general advice.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ivana. We go to our second speaker, Tony van der Tocht. He's a PhD candidate at the Institute of History in Leiden and a former Dutch diplomat with decades of experience in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He currently serves as an associate fellow at the Klingendael Russia and Eastern Europe Center in The Hague. And Tony will take us into the strategic narrative behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A narrative shaped over decades, not just in military terms, but through ideology, cultural exceptionalism and language. His talks will show how rhetoric, when sustained and repeated, doesn't just reflect policy, it becomes policy. Thank you, Tony.
Let's see how this works. Yeah, well, that's me. Shall I sit here? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, and thanks. Great to be here today. And a lot of elements of what I will point to were also addressed by Ivana in her talk, especially the weaponization of language and how language is used. I will talk about narratives because also countries, states, regimes they have stories. They talk about themselves. They talk about the other. And they do this with a reason, because they want to legitimize their policies in the eyes of, well, their fellow countrymen or in the eyes of others in the broader world. My study is about, of my PhD, is about strategic narratives, which is a specific form of narrative, which is used by governments. And they also are closely related to how these countries, in my case Russia, wants to see itself. What is it? What is Russia? What is its identity? And how does it relate to others? What is its legitimate place in world order? And then I will briefly touch upon some of the elements behind this narrative. Russian exceptionalism, Russia as a sovereign power, civilizationism, Russia as a state civilization, as an independent civilization, and their great power status. These are all elements which affect the strategic narrative, how Russia is talking about itself and about others. And then it also relates to the war, to war aims. What are Russia's war aims in Ukraine? Well, they are still the same as they were at the beginning: demilitarization, denazification, and desatanization. And I will get a little bit into what this means in practice when they are saying this, what they mean with those words. And then this is not only about Ukraine, this is about a much broader context. It's about civilization, civilizationism, it's about illiberalism, and what Russia calls a democratization of the world order, in which Russia sees itself as a leading power to lead the global majority, what we sometimes also call the global south. So how these elements relate to, well, especially war and conflict, but a conflict which is broader than only Ukraine. Strategic narratives, I can refer to this book, which is basically from communication studies, media studies, Miskimen, O'Laughlin, and Rosell, when they describe strategic narratives. So it's a structured discourse, a means for political actors to construct a shared meaning of past, present, and future of international politics to shape the behavior of domestic and international actors. Narratives about both states and the system itself, both about who we are and what kind of order we want. So basically, this is a specific type of narrative. I mean, we all use narratives, we all talk about the past and what it means for the present. But this is a deliberate, let's say, approach taken by governments to legitimize their policies by putting out specific narratives. And in the Russian case, I mean, these narratives are mainly developed in the Kremlin, or what to say, in the presidential administration. And my own research goes into how the IR scholars in Russia relate to these narratives. And well, I have been in a dialogue with them, with a lot of them, over about 10 years or even more. And they also struggle with this. So you see also inside the country a form of narrative contestation. So not everyone goes along with the official narrative. And some of my colleagues, or actually a lot of my former colleagues, are now in Europe or in the US because they cannot do their research in the way they want it inside Russia. Also has something to do with I was a diplomat before. I served in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I've also seen a change in Russian diplomacy, in how Russian diplomats act, and how they have to take this narrative, this official narrative, have to take that into account. In the past, I mean, there were always tough negotiators. They always knew their briefs very well. They were professional. You could have a big fight and then afterwards have a nice vodka. But there has been a kind of sea change also inside Russian diplomacy. And they're acting more and more as propagandists because they have to, well, maybe not believe, but they have to put out this strategic narrative also in their own work. And I once told a Russian colleague, diplomat in The Hague, I said, well, okay, you can, because, well, we had big fight about MH17, about what happened in Syria with chemical weapons, about Skripal, attempt of murder in the UK. And I said, well, listen, you can lie to us once, you can lie to us twice, but there will be a time when you will speak the truth and we won't believe you anymore. And that's a serious problem, not only for me, also for you, because trust is then completely gone. So the meaning, that's about also the meaning of words. I mean, if you don't have this trust anymore, that you are on the same baseline, then it's very difficult to find or to have a reasonable conversation and to find some kind of solution or a compromise. About this Russian exceptionalism, what is central is that, especially since 2012, when Putin got back to the Kremlin for the third time, Russia is increasingly presenting itself as a state civilization, государство цивилизация, so a separate civilization. So this has nothing to do with universalism or universal human rights or things like that. Russia has got its own values, its own culture, its traditional values, very closely connected with the Russian Orthodox Church. And that is the Russian identity. The identity was described in late Tsarist times as authoritarianism, orthodoxy, and nation. And basically, they have reintroduced the same concepts into the current narrative. What you see here is an icon with Moscow as the third Rome. This is also an old idea that, Rome was the center of Christianity, of Christendom. Then it moved to Constantinople, and after that fell to the Ottoman Empire. The center moved to Moscow. So they are the center of the Christian Orthodox world. And a lot of concepts which they use, like the Russian world and what that implies, and another concept, katechon, Russia as the restrainer. They have to keep evil from coming into Russia, from threatening the identity. Those concepts are also coming from not only older philosophers, but also from thinkers inside the church. And that also means that religion is also weaponized. It's also used in this case as an instrument of war. Because increasingly the war in Ukraine is now also presented as a kind of holy war. And you see the same dehumanization of the enemy, whereas before, they talked about brothers. Ukrainian were the little brothers, or the smaller brothers. Now they are, they are misled. They are Nazis, or they are supported by Nazis. And so they're not humans. They're just enemies. So you can kill them. And it is because it's a struggle for the identity of Russia, for its status as a great power, for the Russian world. You will be a hero if you die. Your sins will be forgiven. So you see priests blessing tanks and missiles and stuff like that. So they're fully on the same line. And I know also dissidents inside the church, and some have moved here, and they no longer want to have anything to do with the patriarch in Moscow. But this has grown over the years as a kind of, well, on the one hand, a kind of defense against what Russia sees as foreign malign influence. So the spread of democratic values and human rights, because it threatens the regime. So it was used as a defense, and on the other hand, it is also used now as a kind of offensive weapon to reach out to others who also believe in authoritarian leaders or traditional values and family values. So they want to get allies inside Europe or inside the US who want to talk along the same ways and accept such talk. So they're also using to divide other societies, not necessarily to have them completely on their side, but also to, let's say, to sow confusion. So that what Ivana talked about, the post-truth society, that also applies there. The other picture you see there is a kind of, photoshopped Yalta agreement. The end of the Second World War. In that case, it was, of course, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill. And here you see Putin, Xi Jinping and Trump. Because the Russian idea is that the only sovereign powers are great powers. And they deal with each other. So it's like what Trump is now also trying to do. So they are the only ones who are fully sovereign, and they deal with the smaller ones among themselves. And they have a full right to have their own sphere of influence. Well, that's the way they see it. And the great power status is a very important element in this Russian political thinking. So if Russia is not a great power, what is it? This also affects even a lot of people in the opposition who will still say, well, yes, Putin is bad and we want a more federal democratic structure, but still this Russian empire, is this imperialism, can they really say that it's a bad thing? Yeah, okay, maybe the war is bad. But you hear also people, opposition people, really struggling with that. So if Russia is not an empire, yes, what is it? So these are important elements of this whole narrative. They have developed over many years, and which has now culminated, let's say, led to also the war in Ukraine. Sovereignty is also an important one. We saw that already years ago when Russia said, well, we are a sovereign democracy. So also giving another meaning to certain words. We would call it a managed democracy or something like that. A sovereign democracy. It's our democracy, whether you like it or not. We have the full right to have our own form of also democracy. Then I get to the war aims in Ukraine. Demilitarization. How the war is presented it's a defensive operation. Well, it's not even called a war, as was rightly pointed out, a special military operation. But it's presented not as an offensive act, but as defense, because the collective West was using Ukraine as a kind of platform against Russia. So they're trying to come up with a kind of threat. We are threatened, and this is a kind of preventive action, because otherwise they will threaten Russia, also militarily. Although I do think that the basic problem is that a more democratic Ukraine, more democratic than Russia, would be a bad example for the Russian regime, because people could ask the question, why can't we have a more democratic system? So in that sense, Russia has always seen both the color revolutions in the former Soviet states, Georgia, Ukraine twice, but also in Yugoslavia and in the Arab Spring. Russia has constantly been framing that as acts instigated from abroad, and especially by the US, ultimately aimed at Russia. So a regime change in Kiev opens the threat to ultimately also have a regime change in Moscow on Red Square. So that is how it is presented. Demilitarization means not only not being member of NATO, but being, well, weak so that Russia can dominate it and tell Ukraine what it should do. Denazification, it is presented also as, well, the government in Kiev is presented as Nazis. Very strange how you frame this with a Jewish president and all that, but okay, so it builds on certain elements of history. Of course, in the past, you had extreme right wing and people in Ukraine, some cooperating also with the Nazis against the Soviets. But they pick up a number of those elements and say, well, there was a Nazi coup, and it's supported by the West. It is just like the Great Patriotic War or the Second World War all over again. And our boys are fighting this war all over again. Last time we won, and we will win again. So this is the story of this, and this, of course, this plays to also to the emotions of people, because a lot of people still know about, their ancestors who fought in the Second World War. So Russia is claiming that as, a success. Russia alone defeated the Nazis, and they have to do this again. And another thing is how this is framed. We had to do this. There is no alternative, because Ukraine is, the Russian speakers are part of this Russian world, and we have the duty and the obligation to protect them. So when they are threatened in some fundamental rights, like not able to speak their own language or whatever, this was even framed as a kind of genocide in Donetsk, in the east of Ukraine. So then they had the obligation, yes, we can't do otherwise, we have to intervene in a form of, let's say, Russian responsibility to protect. The satanization was later also regularly used. It's a holy war because Russia has to protect its own Christian identity, the Christian Orthodox identity, from all this kind of influence from abroad. Not only human rights or democratization, but also what they also are fiercely against, all this woke nonsense. And Europe is framed in that sense as gay Europe. And that is used as well in other countries like Georgia. So then they are telling the Georgians in the same line, in the same narrative, do you really want to become a member of the European Union? Then they will force same-sex marriage on you. Do you really want that? And you have, of course, very conservative societies that, no, we don't want that. Okay, you belong more to us. And so this whole, also this whole Eurasian Economic Union, which they constructed, for Putin, this was presented as a civilizational choice. You belong to us, to our civilization. To protect, the Christian Orthodox world, which is specifically, centered on Moscow. This is about Ukraine, but it is a much broader discourse, in fact, about do you have one civilization which is moving in a certain, well, positive direction, progress, Fukuyama, end of history, or do you have several civilizations which can all follow their own path and are based on their own cultural and historical traditions? So it is very much against universalism, and it doesn't answer the question, okay, but are there any things which we as humanity still have in common? Because even if you have your own cultural or civilizational traditions, you can still have some elements in common. But that discussion is not waged, because it is more like weaponized as us, our civilization, against them who want to undermine us. Illiberalism also it's an illiberal discourse. It's a discourse about, well, authoritarianism, the old triad from Tsarist times: authoritarianism, orthodoxy, and nation, the Russian nation. So a lot of other, let's say, illiberal regimes, like Orban in Hungary, or also Trump, or let's say the alt-right in the US, they like this type of discourse. They also say, well, what this liberalism means, it's woke, we need a strong leader, and we have to protect our family values, and so they're also using this in outside of Russia. And then the democratization of world order. They use this word democratization because how this is presented is that we are against Western hegemony, and especially what they call the global majority. They go to them and say, oh, listen, we would like to, you can do what you want. We won't bother you with human rights and all the kind of conditionality. You can do what you want. We just deal with you on a pragmatic basis, on a transactional basis. And then we support you, like we supported you when we were still the Soviet Union in your decolonization wars. And of course, Ukraine, for example, is trying to counter that and to tell countries in Africa, listen, this is our decolonization war now, what is going on in Ukraine. And you should support us. And also the European Union has been trying to support Ukraine in putting forward that narrative, that counter-narrative. But then the problem is always that the way we frame it is this is about the international legal order, and then immediately you get back to questions about double standards. Listen, you are now talking about Ukraine, but where were you when the genocide in Rwanda happened? Where are you now with Israel and Palestine? So it's very nice that you talk about these things and that we have to support you to protect international legal order, but yeah, what about it? So these are, let's say, the broader issues which not only Russia is putting on the agenda. So this is about how you talk about world order, and if there is still a way out in the form of either a dialogue of civilizations, but you still have to find first common words and terms to deal with each other. But Russia is not the only one putting forward itself as a state civilization. I mean, you have the same with China, in what different way, but it's also separate civilization. There's a book called The State Civilizations by Christopher Coker. He recently died as a professor at the London School of Economics, I think. And he talked about not only Russia, but also China, but also ISIS, also talking about itself, although not a state, but as a separate civilization, and as the proponent of a separate civilization. So then, this leaves us all with the big question, if the world is so fragmented, and also talking about the world order in such a fragmented way, where can you still find common ground? And then I hope that there are still counter-narratives, But whether that is enough or whether we would have to get back to what you said about Judith Butler, to try and reclaim the narrative and reclaim a different kind of narrative which puts the whole of humanity first and not this kind of fragmented discourse. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Well, questions? I saw your hand first, sorry.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. Yeah, I was wondering when you have, you know, about the strategy of actually dealing with those things, coming back to the first way of reclaiming words and meanings. Because in an authoritarian discourse like this one, it becomes very hard to actually have a counter narrative to reclaim your words. So my question is more like, should we just have this as a strategy or try to come up with a new dictionary or a new playbook completely different from that one?
Good question.
I think it would be possible to come up with another, not necessarily a counter-narrative, but our own narrative. And I still hope for, let's say, a European narrative, which is also different from what the US is doing and telling itself, and based on European values, being more inclusive. But then we should also not only, we should practice what we preach. So that also means that if we condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we should also condemn what Israel is doing in Gaza. Otherwise, you don't have a credible narrative. And I know that in Europe this is very difficult. You have so many countries and to get them all on one line. But I think ultimately that is the only way forward to create a credible European narrative. I think, I mean, also Russia is struggling with that. Russia is now framing the war in Ukraine as a war against the collective West. But does the collective West still exist anymore after Trump? I mean, there is more and more talk of Westlessness about, well, what, I mean, if Trump leaves NATO, or even if he distances himself so much from international legal norms, I mean, is this still an ally? Or how to deal with that? But I think Europe should somehow get united also in this respect and have its own narrative, but then it should be credible.
Okay, I saw your hand.
Can I hold it? Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a brief kind of consideration about the second part of your talk about Russian self-identity. I think when we say identity, there is also like a certain idea that comes with it, that this is how indeed we understand and people understand themselves. But I think it's worth highlighting about the extent to which this type of discourse that you described is also a certain kind of strategic narrative and a certain product, because at the same time as these words are indeed being spoken everywhere, we see also that the majority of representatives of Russian elite have no problem having really nice vacations in Nice, in Courchevel, sending their children to the UK, Switzerland, and so forth. And on the other hand, for example, with the discourse kind of for the traditional marriages against LGBT, we also see that this is actually a language that was pretty much adopted from American neoconservatives in the early 2000s. So we also see actually that it is not so much a very particular type of discourse, but it's also kind of, and particular Russian values, but it's also another type of kind of, say, authoritarian or right-wing international, whatever you want to call it, that is emerging. And I think it's worth pointing out these kind of big discrepancies between like the discourse and reality of things.
Yeah, I think very good point. I think this is, well, you have a number of elements which are Russia-specific, but a number of other elements which you also see elsewhere in a kind of, well, I would see it as a kind of, well, fight against the effects of globalism. So people do not know where to belong. Do they belong everywhere? Or do they have no home anymore? So it's also this belonging to a certain community, however it's friend. you see that in Russia in a specific way. The big question is still, also to me, do people really believe it? Because, okay, this is put forward by the government. And, well, we all know that in late Soviet times, well, you had the official ideology, but nobody really believed it. And they had to proclaim it. They had to put a number of citations of Lenin in the text. But, and in the present situation of war, it's very difficult to find out what people really think. So there are opinion polls, there are relatively independent opinion polls, but a lot of people well, they just want to go on with their life and not be bothered by the bad news or by the war. And the government is trying to somehow put forward a situation that everything is normal, everything is under control, especially for the bigger cities. So, I mean, if you go to Moscow now, I think a lot of things, life goes on. And the government deliberately wants to keep it like that. But so it's very difficult to find out what people really think, whether they're really motivated by these ideas. Also this kind of religious ideas that you die for your religion and then you go to heaven. I don't know. When I lived in Russia, I mean, people were not that, okay, orthodoxy may be part of the culture of going back to cultural roots, but very religious, yeah, maybe with Easter or Christmas they will go to the church. And I once asked, I had a driver there once, and he had a young baby, he had it baptized, and I said, oh, well, are you a believer? And he said, well, yeah, you never know, so better be safe than sorry. So I don't know whether this really motivates people. And I was also struck by a book which, there's one relatively high-level Russian diplomat who left the diplomatic service after the start of the war, Bondaryov, and he wrote a book about how it works inside the foreign ministry. And it was called Im Ministerium der Lügen, yeah, it's only in German for some reason, so in the Ministry of Lies. And what he describes also is a lot of doublethink. People know that they have to tell this kind of bullshit. They don't believe in it, but they still have to prove their loyalty and go with the flow. Otherwise, they could lose their job. So also here you see people can think one way and have to proclaim their loyalty in another way.
Okay, thank you very much. Because of the time, I'll go to the third speaker, but there's still some room for questions later. But I would like to introduce Madeleine Lee now, a philosopher at TU Delft and a practitioner of the anti-debate, a form of structured dialogue developed by the UK think tank Perspectiva, where traditional debate seeks to win, anti-debate seeks understanding through intellectual humility, active listening, and the willingness to sit with paradox. So tonight, Madeleine will invite us into a different mode of conversation, using poetic fragments and reflective exercises. It's a small taste, and this is important, of the deeper anti-debate sessions she'll lead on the May 26th, for which you're all invited to come. A space for people who feel at loss for words in the face of political crisis. So the words to you, Madeleine.
Thank you, thanks. Good, you got the admin out of the way because I was worried that I would forget that. So it's nice to be here. Nice is maybe the wrong word, but when I was invited, some time ago, I've been really walking, this is where I do all my thinking as a philosopher. I've been really walking and trying to figure out what I might have to offer this evening. And so what I have to offer is in the form of confession of hypocrisy, and some poetry. And then we'll also do a little exercise, which is it's actually not included in the anti-debate, but it's a small piece, what I like to think of it as like a little bit of a softening in this topic, which can be so fraught. So I hope you'll trust me in the next little bit. I'm Canadian, and I don't know if you knew, but there was a Canadian election yesterday. And I'm moving back to Canada in June 10th. It's very strange to be Canadian right now. In my life, I'm 36 years old. In my life, I have not really questioned the relationship with the United States in terms of safety. I've questioned the United States. But in terms of military occupation of Canada, I tell you now, this is not something that has ever entered my mind, maybe like as a joke or something at some point. And so some weeks ago, I found myself lying in bed having a rare little sleep-in, and I could hear my children laughing in the other room, and I could hear my husband talking. And for the very first time in 36 years, I thought, what if the United States just took Canada? I don't really know what take means there, but it was the first time I'd ever thought about that, or kind of really I'd never heard anyone else really say that either. And so there is this slow opening of, on what feels like the precipice of change, and I don't know what that change is going to be. And you can see I'm a little nervous to even say it in front of you on a microphone now. And then I started to think, well, we live in the country, that seems good, but we're pretty close to the border, so maybe we should move farther north, just as a, safety strategy. And then I thought, there's this old gun in the house. And I actually don't think, well, we're in the Netherlands, so we're far away. I'm not sure that it's legal. I think it was left by the farmer before. It's not, I don't know if it is even still in the house. But again, for the very first time in my entire life, I thought, are we supposed to get a gun? And what are the gun laws in Canada? Because I'm actually not sure about them. All I know is that they're supposed to be different than the United States, but I'm not sure what they are. Never did I ever think of this before. So I was interested in the questions after, and you spoke a little bit about the silences and the things we don't dare to utter. And creeping in are these pieces, these ideas, these visions that I have never thought about before. And so quietly one Tuesday evening, I lit some candles after the kids went to sleep, and I sat my husband down, and I said, I think every 30 seconds I say, I know this sounds crazy, but, I know this sounds crazy, but, I know this sounds crazy, but. And we had a very strange conversation. Foreign, coming off the tongue in fragments, not smooth, not well thought out, not very eloquent or intelligent sounding. And yet, there's also, I just had this feeling like I don't even know how to talk about war. So that's what I wanted to bring to you today, is that I don't really know how to talk about war, and I want to tell you many of the reasons why I don't feel like I'm supposed to talk about war, but then, of course, offer that anybody can talk about war. I don't feel like I have a really in-depth historical understanding of geopolitics. I can't really remember when I read like a news article and there's lots of dates in it. I can't really remember that. I'm some kind of philosopher, but I'm not one that remembers dates. My brother is brilliant at this. He knows history from very long time all the way up until today. And when I say, I cannot believe this is happening, he's kind of like, well, obviously. And so I sort of shrink a little bit and sort of hide a little bit because, well, maybe I should have understood that this was going to happen. And maybe it was actually obvious, and now here we are. And I didn't really understand all that was moving towards this moment. And there's the privilege of it. There's the privilege, and I know this falls under white fragility, for sure. There's the privilege that I might be concerned about a piece of land that was once taken violently from others. And yet, do I even have the right to be upset about the prospect of it being taken away from me? And so these larger questions, I find I'm trying to figure out what I can say and what I can't say. And I'm finding that those things that I've deemed that I can't say, or I'm not smart enough and I don't understand, and all of these pieces, I've started to realize how often I say them in my head and realize that we can just maybe put those aside for a moment. Because there are these echoes of centuries of men, mostly men, saying that some war is a crime and some's not. And that this is an okay way to take a life, and this is not an okay way to take a life. And those voices of history, of institutions, are this close to drowning out something deeper that I know, which is that life is precious, and that taking it can never, it just cannot be right or wrong. Yeah?
What if you take a life of a criminal, for example, that is committing a crime? I think that is not per se wrong. It's up to debate.
Yeah.
Can anybody hear him speaking? Or, yeah? Okay.
I'll repeat it. What if you take the life of a criminal, and that could be up for debate? Right. And so my next point, the hypocrisy of what I just said. And we'll be able to talk about that more. Thank you. The hypocrisy, which is that though I'm talking about the preciousness of a life and saying that it cannot be right, if I might be pushed to it, again, in these frightening visions of the future, potential future, if I was pushed to it, maybe I might do that too. And maybe there are some circumstances where I would want revenge or something like this. And so I hold that within me as well. So, hypocrisy is there. And I want to bring you to one moment of hypocrisy, and then we'll move into and then I'm going to read you a poem, and we'll move into our exercise. So I'm speaking to you from the heart today. I think hopefully you can feel that. I did not do this recently. I'm a lecturer here at the university, and as a lecturer over the last year, I can feel the desire to speak openly about war and military use, especially with technology. I can feel that is needed. So thank you for hosting this. And when I was teaching a class in robotics, I left till the last lecture, I left this inquiry into military use of robotics and autonomous use of weapons, or autonomous weapons. And what I could feel it, and I could feel that there was some emotion quite clear in the room, and so I thought, okay, let's just do a full lecture on it. And while in that lecture there were glimmers of me being there and really meeting the students, I mostly hid behind philosophical papers. I mostly hid behind the logical argumentation about whether or not we should, what we should do with a criminal, for example. These philosophical debates where we get to our strategy, logistic mind. And I don't think that that's what was needed. I think, unfortunately, the lecture hall really doesn't help for this because you're in front of all these students and you're in the front. And it's really not designed for meeting each other. It's not designed for communing with one another. But what I did is I went through some papers on whether or not you should kill somebody with a weapon, with a robotic weapon. I think that that was not the best use of that moment. And so what I would have done is read a poem. Because poetry doesn't follow logic. It doesn't follow straight lines. It doesn't follow linearity. There's holes in it, but there's visuals, and you can feel that a real person has written it. And all of these aspects of poetry open up a different kind of conversation. So I am going to read you a poem that is hard to hear and hard for me to read. I don't love that I'm thrusting it upon people who didn't voluntarily come here. But they're looking away, so. Yeah, I cried when I read this afternoon, so I might cry again, and you might cry, and yeah. Lessons in Palestinian Motherhood, 101, by Maya Abu al-Hayat. To be a Palestinian mother, you must learn some simple things. How to hold your wounded child until he sheds his last drop of blood. Crafting words to turn a child into a man. When the soldiers wake him for arrest. How to prepare a filling meal for 10 when bakers, malls, restaurants are bombed. And how to tell delightful stories through long nights of shelling. Explaining to a 3-year-old the absence of the martyred father and detained sister. Erecting colorful tents from cushion covers, finding innovative ways to clean blood, rejoicing that they arrested the child but did not kill him. How to dig graves and build graveyards, how to walk by a tank with 5 children, and cross the path to exile with 3 suitcases and 7 souls. You have to be a cat, a crocodile, a plane, a protective shield, the roof of a tent, and the stars when the power is out. A poem when even tears are dry. You must be everything, the water and the rock. That's another way to talk about war. It's another way. And a little more scary because it's a little more vulnerable. And I can't hide behind my, clever arguments. But poetry, I think, within the larger conversation can offer this place to meet one another. And I think we're going to do an exercise in that now. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some pieces of paper. Oh, here. Can you pass these around? Can pass these around, and we'll just take 5 minutes to do it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is private. I want you to, if you want, of course, if you want, to write down, well, anything that's come up in me talking. And specifically, if you'd like, to write down anything, this is for you too, that you, like me, may have been too worried to utter. Something that you feel like maybe feels like a bit of a conspiracy theory, and then won't everybody think you're weird if you say it out loud. And also, if this speaks to you, all of the ways you've been silent and why. Like me, too worried that I'm not as smart as my brother, or I don't understand things properly, or what I'm asking for is unreasonable. You just take some minutes. In any of those pieces, you write anything down, and they don't have to be great sentences, okay? I see some of you are done, and some of you are still writing, so if you're still writing, please do so. I think it can, I offer this as a first step, maybe. I think of this as sort of like dumping out all of the things you're worried about in a sort of private space. And then noticing all those fears that you might have or worries that you might have, so that then you can say, okay, I can still talk about it. You can still talk about it. You can still fumble on your words. You can also still change your mind. This is a big worry that I have, is that maybe I'll say something and then I'll think something different. You can change your mind. And so the anti-debate, it's a bit tricky in this format because it's a bit small and we don't know each other. And so to really form this sort of deep conversation, we need time together. Time together in the anti-debate, it's 3 hours. So what I do encourage you to come, to be able to spend the time together, to be able to change your mind over it and evolve or not, to really meet each other, not in this traditional debate format of us, like you and then our side, which sounds quite, like a military style. We've already spoken about that. So the anti-debate is not doing that. It means that we can commune together, and though we inevitably have tensions, we may exist with some sense of grace together. And that takes some time. So thank you for writing anything down, and thank you for listening to this, and I hope to see you on May 26th. Yeah.
For this exercise in humanity, we have, let's say we take 3-4 minutes for questions, and then you can still ask questions when people are there at the bar and drinking, etc. But if there was any question now, yeah, okay, I saw this person first, sorry. No, I'll take it.
I wanted to ask the second speaker about the, let's say, ideology of Russia as a whole, if it can exist as a country without having to rely on such philosophers as Alexander Dugin, for example, who is one of the, for the context, one of the people who is behind Putin's philosophy himself, with whether his justification of the idea of Great Russia and that it should be this Eurasian project of geopolitical superpower, basically. And without that project, without Ukraine as its part, it cannot exist.
Yeah, good point. The problem with ideology in Russia is that officially ideology after the Soviet Union fell apart is forbidden. So there won't be another state ideology. They put it in the constitution. Dugin is one of those people, operators, who put forward some ideas, who are very, let's say, pragmatic and trying to find out where the political winds are blowing. So he wasn't very popular in the 1990s. He came up, he went down. I think that the current ideology, if you can call it that, some call it Putinism. I don't like that because it's not focused only on Putin. And it will also survive Putin, I'm afraid. All these people are, I mean, the center of who is actually building this ideology, I think, is in the presidential administration. At the moment, it's Mr. Kirienka who is responsible for internal politics. Before, it was people like Surkov. And they're coming up with these type of ideas, and they are looking at who in these networks of ideas can support them, who is useful. So if some of these ideas of Dugin's are useful, they'll take them on board. So for a long time, they are just balancing between different groups and picking some ideas. Although over the last few years, the discourse has hardened. So it's now more difficult to go against the official discourse. So the fact that you cannot talk about war, but also, you cannot freely do your research in university. I mean, you have to walk sometimes very fine lines. Some of my colleagues have been telling me about teaching in universities, something like about EU-Russia relations, and telling me then that I have to be very careful because otherwise some students or colleagues can snitch on me that I'm not patriotic enough, and then I get fired. So that is the way this is working now, and therefore I'm also not very optimistic about a compromise or a way out of the war, since it is framed as a kind of existential war for the soul of Russia, for the identity of Russia, and indeed that Russia cannot do without Ukraine, because otherwise it's not an empire anymore, and it cannot envisage being anything else. So it's a very complicated situation. And it's also very difficult to find, especially nowadays, to find out which people really influence the discourse. There are some people who, like Sergei Karaganov in the past. Yeah, was he really leading the discourse, or did he simply know how the winds were blowing and just following the discourse which is coming from somewhere else? But that's still a good area of research to get into.
Thank you, Tony. One last question, and then you can still ask questions, but then over there. So don't feel desperate if you run out of time.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think you've done a very good job explaining the wrong things that Russia is doing, and you recently mentioned that it's very hard to find a compromise with them, but wouldn't you also think that to be able to find a compromise, we should also look into what our side is doing? And by this I mean, for example, if you look at the interventions made after the fall of the Soviet Union, we have the US-led NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, which is illegal in any international court. We have the Iraq invasion, which is also illegal in any international court. We have the Libya intervention, which then proved to be a regime change of Ghadi, which was also illegal by UN standards. And the idea here is that I think that we should also be more objective when we look into our side, because we are not perfect in any way, shape, or form. So it's not black or white. We are also bad by the same terms that we accuse Russia of being bad. And we can also see that, for example, all those three invasions, all those three illegal interventions happened before the Crimea intervention in 2014. So then the question is if Russia has any legitimate case to say that they may also fear for their security. I'm not making the case for them, but I'm making the case that we should analyze also our position. And one last thing to add some context. In the Iraq intervention in 2003, there were at least 15 times more dead civilians than there have been in Ukraine since the war started. So if you're talking about morality, there were much more civilians dead after intervention done by the United States.
Okay, I don't think it's about numbers. I mean, morality is, well, okay, you can have smaller numbers, but it's still immoral, even if you kill a few people. I think you have a good point that, yes, we also made mistakes. And as I said before, that as a European, I feel that we should not apply double standards. So the American invasion of Iraq on completely trumped up arguments and illegal, as you rightly said. I mean, as European, we should also criticize that. So I don't think that the Netherlands should have supported this. But that doesn't affect that the US is also often acting in an illegal way. Doesn't condone what Russia's doing. So we should still be able to criticize Russia for the violations of international right, international law, humanitarian law, and whatever. So if they come with trumped up charges like, yes, but we have to go into Crimea because otherwise tomorrow there will be NATO flags in Sevastopol. So sorry, but I don't buy this. And what for me is most important, and there I disagree with the Russian discourse because they think everything is always coming from abroad. It should be foreign instigated. It cannot be that people want something different. And I think people do want sometimes something different, like people in Ukraine on Maidan, or I mean, the Arab Spring. I mean, it started with a guy who burned himself because of completely different reasons than that he was paid for by the Americans to come up with a revolution in Tunisia. So the Russians are always trying to frame that or to tell, yes, but the Americans are also, yes, okay, maybe you're right, but it doesn't condone what you are doing now. It's still a violation of international law. And there can be people, countries who think differently and who want a different future, apart from you. So it's not Moscow who can decide what people in the former Soviet, all over the former Soviet Union should do or think or be friends with.
Okay, well, this is certainly an ongoing debate. And we're going to debate further over there. Thank you all very much for coming. Please take a look at our program one slide further. A program for when it comes down to War and Entropy. So next Tuesday there will be, let's say, lectures on the first-person war, the introduction of drones and how it changed the battlefield. And then one thing I really want to point out, you can find everything on our website, is the anti-debate. So we need students who are willing to put the hours in, 3 hours, something like that. But as Madeline already explained, it's worth it. It's a kind of an in-depth exploration of our emotions and our vulnerabilities when it comes down to language. So I hope you really sign up to it. And now I want to invite you over there to drinks and some snacks. Thank you very much for coming and for paying attention. Thank you very much.